Good evening, everybody. Welcome to all who have joined us, and thank you for giving us all the opportunity to discuss this powerful performance of If I Forget. I was thrilled to have been asked to moderate this talk back because, likely as many of you who watched this amazing and powerful performance, it was overflowing with rich themes and questions that center on Jewish identity, many of which are very resonant today. Perhaps even more so than in 2011 when Stephen Levenson began writing this play. So my job of guiding this conversation tonight is going to be very easy, I believe. We will have the opportunity to discuss the play with the director, Robert Leff, our panelists, Rabbi Coburn and Rabbi Bressler, and the cast. So just to give you a sense of the lay of the evening, we're going to begin with a few questions that I will direct at the director, Robert, and then a few questions for our panelists. And then we are hoping that there will be many questions that will bubble up from all of you attending here today that you can direct at the cast or at any of the panelists here. So as we are speaking together, please put any questions that you have in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So let's jump right in. I'm going to begin by introducing Robert Leff, who is the director of If I Forget. And Robert has been directing for 50 years. This is his 8th show that he's directing for the Majestic Readers Theater. And we are looking forward to hearing some of his thoughts about how he came to direct this film. So more pointedly, I want to ask you, Robert, about how you discovered If I Forget, and why, of all of the plays that you must come across, why was it important for you to stage a reader's theater version of this particular play?
Okay. In February 2018, a magazine that I subscribed to, American Theater, had published an article entitled Outsiders of Long Standing, What U.S. Jewish Narratives Have to Say in an Age of Rising Hatred and Exclusion. They talked about two plays and a musical. The first play, it was Indecent by Paula Vogel. The musical was The Band's Visit by Itamar Moses and David Yazbek. And the second play was If I Forget by Stephen Levenson. And it sounded, Levenson's play sounded interesting. And so I sent away for a copy from Dramati's Play Service. I read it. I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. It has a lot of interesting things to say. And so I submitted it, and then the play reading committee picked it. From the two plays I submitted, they chose If I Forget. One of the reasons I always tell people that in dramatic literature or in theater, the three best known Jewish characters are Shylock from The Merchant of Venice, Anne Frank from The Diary of Anne Frank, and Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. But I know there are many, many more plays that have Jewish characters. And those are old plays, whereas If I Forget is contemporary. So here's a play, I thought, it's a young voice, a voice we probably don't know very much about, although Levenson is probably better known for the book, he wrote the book for the musical Dear Evan Hansen. And so that's how I came to do the play. Submit the play, and that's basically my introduction and why I chose it.
Thank you, Robert. So let me ask a follow-up, which may be a little bit more personal. So feel free to indulge us as much as you feel comfortable.
Okay.
This play is set in 2000, 2001, and I'm wondering if you might speak to the relevance of some of the themes that really touched you around Jewish identity. 20 years later, right? This play is now, I guess, 20 years after the play was staged. It was written in 2011. So are there ways in which some of the issues that are explored in the play around Jewish identity are becoming more relevant to you in the year 2020, 2021, when you were staging this, due to recent events in America, in the Jewish world? Are there particular themes that around Jewish identity and what's going on in our world today that felt particularly compelling to you in today's world?
Yes. Well, technically, I should say that I jokingly say I'm Jewish from the waist down. My father was Jewish, my mother was Catholic. So I guess in some circles, I'm not considered Jewish. But certainly the events, I mean, when the play was first done in 2017, an article appeared in Playbill, which is when you go to a professional theater in New York or other cities, you get your program is called a Playbill. And there was an article of Stephen Levenson about Levenson and the play. And the title of the article was How 2017 Gave, If I Forget, Scary Relevance. And in it, he said, Levenson says that he just assumed after the 26th, at the 26th, the result of the 2016 election would mean that we wouldn't have to hear from Donald Trump anymore. And so he said, obviously that did not happen. And so the rise of anti-Semitism, or the overtones of anti-Semitism in the campaign of 2016 certainly put a different spin that he hadn't intended when he wrote the play. So I think that is one of the themes. One of the things that Michael says is we're white and everyone eats bagels. They watch Seinfeld in Topeka. We've arrived. And as Levenson points out, and I would point out, that may not be true. That everything is safe for Jews. So I think that certainly is relevant too. And some of the lines that he writes that are in the play kind of remind me of things I heard during the 2020 election. Who is going to be a better president for the Jews? And that certainly comes up in the play when Michael finds out that Sharon didn't vote for Gore. She voted for Bush. And she says, because he'd be better for the Jews. So those are some of the things.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, for raising the kind of, bringing us to the core, one of the core themes of the play. And I want to bring in our panelists, Rabbi Raquel Coburn and Rabbi Phil Bressler, who, before you answer this question, maybe you'll just give a brief intro and your connection to the play and how you came to be here today. But I want to ask each of you to hone in on one issue that Robert is gesturing towards, which is anti-Semitism, and in particular, the centrality of the Holocaust in the formation of Jewish identity and in Jewish education. And as I'm sure you saw, Michael in the play has very strong feelings about the ways in which the Holocaust is overdetermined in aspects of Jewish identity, perhaps because this was the case in his own family, or because perhaps this is one of the features of Jewish education in our world. So I'd like to ask each of you, Rabbi Coburn and Rabbi Bressler, if you can speak to the role of the Holocaust in Jews' identity from your vantage point. To what degree do you see the Holocaust playing a central role in Jewish identity formation today? And more broadly, what does it mean to center one's Jewish identity on a past collective trauma? I know those are big questions, but to the degree that you want to tackle them, and maybe we'll start with Rabbi Coburn, and if you could just say a word about yourself, and then we'll move to Rabbi Bressler.
Sure. Yeah, that's a huge question. So I'm Raquel Coburn, and I'm connected to this because I have the privilege of being the rabbi at the community where Wendy Aronson is a member. And I really so enjoyed seeing this play for so many reasons. You all did a fabulous job. And it was just such a delight to particularly watch Wendy in her acting. And Wendy, I prefer your hair as it is now, although the wig looked lovely. So this is a huge question, and I have many different thoughts on it. And so I'm just going to sort of I'll share sort of where I am and where my thoughts are, and hopefully that will be like helpful for people and they're sort of thinking more deeply about this. So I think that one of the things that I was struck by in this play is that Michael's a professor, right? And on some level for him, the Holocaust is history, and Jewish practice is about the history. People did this, we don't do this anymore, right? He doesn't have an affection or a love or a soul connection to Jewish ritual, to Jewish practice in any way. But he does have this sort of intellectual connection, and the intellectual connection is about history versus what I would say is memory. And I think that as Jews, I often say that we are much more of a people of memory than we are a people of history. And that memory is about what sort of moves us and moves us to exist and be in this world as modern people and as modern Jews, collectively and individually. And I think that it's for that reason that there's sort of the inspiration of the Holocaust and the challenge of the Holocaust. So this is what I mean by that. So on one hand, there's a challenge for us rabbis who love Israel, fiercely love Israel, but sometimes disagree with the politics of the government of Israel, to voice that often in our congregations, because it feels to many of our congregants as if we are like punching them in the stomach and taking away something that feels very safe for them. Like challenging Israel is challenging Israel on a much bigger level. And that feels like emotionally difficult. I often say it's like a third rail. It's the rail that electrocutes you. I can say whatever I want about Donald Trump. Some people might leave, and they have actually, but like more people will come, and like on some level, people don't feel that I'm like attacking them at their core. Israel feels like it's an attack. And the reason that I will suggest that that is because half of my congregation or more has a bag packed. Now that's a metaphor, but has a bag packed so that because when things get really bad here, we need Israel, right? Like our existence is challenged without the notion of Israel. So questioning Israel or questioning what Israel does becomes very challenging. Now I wanted to just play that forward with the Holocaust. And so the reality of how we see that sometimes that means active Jews who have used, who hit the Holocaust plays like a piece in their memory, but it's not their full memory. Sometimes what that means is Jews that come out for Yom HaShoah, but will not come out for Purim and will not come out for Simchat Torah. None of the joyful Jewish experiences are they interested in embracing. But the harsh memories, right? They dig deep into the Holocaust because somehow that's the memory that sort of stirs them. As a rabbi, that's challenging for me because I think that Judaism is filled with such incredible joy, such deep, profound wisdom that enables us to live our lives with purpose. I think that Torah actualized in our time is what inspires us to be better, deeper, more thoughtful, more engaged human beings. And that to just have a Judaism that is based on the past is it just feels very sad. So I'll just share a little story before I move on to the next rabbi. But the 1 year for Yom HaShoah at my synagogue when I was working in Austin, I was so aware of this. Like we'd have these citywide events and all these people come up who never come out for other things. So we had this like little sort of like before the Yom HaShoah event, we had this like little kind of fair in the social hall where there were booths of different organizations. And my synagogue, I had this idea, like we're gonna have a tefillin booth and we're gonna invite everybody to put on tefillin because there are so many people who died in the Shoah who weren't able to put on tefillin. Let's do something positive. Let's take that memory and turn it into something positive with a ritual experience. And it was so beautiful. And interestingly, the Orthodox synagogue was like two down, and they came over and they were like, this is amazing. Like watching you like this conservative synagogue doing this. And there are all of these women who were putting on tefillin for the very first time in their lives. And for me, it was like, okay, so we're going to do this. We're going to remember, because at the end of the day, remembering is sacred and is important, but it can't be all it is. Like there's got to be something that pushes us forward into what makes Judaism relevant today. So I don't know that I exactly answered your question, but those are my thoughts on this, and I'll pass it on to my colleague.
Thanks, Rabbi Coburn. And I'll have some, I'm sure there are people that have follow-up questions about this difference between memory and history, which I think is very much at play here. But we'll give Rabbi Bressler a minute to answer that, and I'm happy to repeat any part of that. And just a reminder—
Yeah, it'd be great if you would.
Repeat.
Yeah, could you restate your question just a little bit? I want to make sure I'm focused too. Yeah.
No problem. No problem. So the core question is thinking about kind of many of Michael's claims about the overdetermination of the Holocaust in Jewish identity and in the lives of Jews. And to what degree do you continue to see the Holocaust playing this central role? And if that is the case, what does it mean to have a Jewish identity that is so strongly rooted in traumas of the collective past?
Got it. So on the one hand, I know what he's talking about. I remember growing up. I grew up in, oh, actually, I should introduce myself and say who I am first. So I'm Rabbi Phil Bressler, and my connection here is that I'm the rabbi of the community where Wendy Aronson's dad is a member, Mike Aronson, who's had big involvement with Majestic Theater and all kinds of stuff too. So that's kind of my connection here as well. But I remember growing up, I grew up in a Reformed synagogue in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Yes, Wendy is Holly. And I remember things like putting coins in JNF tzedakah boxes. The tzedakah boxes, the Jewish National Fund, as if Israel, even then in the 90s, the superpower needed my spare change, right? And I remember learning about the Holocaust, even in my religious school, through graphic images, things like piles of shoes and eyeglasses and emaciated bodies piled on one another. And so on the one hand, I can understand what Michael's talking about in his that Jewish identity is built around the Holocaust in a lot of ways, because I think it really at one time it was. I am not so certain that's the case anymore, or at least not necessarily in my experience. I think that there is there are big issues with building identity around that, some of which Michael the character in the play really encountered, and Rabbi Coburn really addressed, which is that trauma that's been a defining factor in the story of Jewish history. Like we can't ignore it, obviously, but focusing on it and sort of allowing it to define us is not a healthy way of processing trauma. There's a kind of Michael on one hand sort of wants to cut that out of Judaism, which I think is in one way an overreaction. We wouldn't try to help someone process trauma in a more individual situation by forgetting it entirely, right? We would try to help them work through it in a meaningful way, or make sense of it, or something like that, process it in a healthier way. So the result of building identity was that for a lot of Jews, their core values of their Jewish identity became things like paranoia, fear, suspicion of non-Jews, desire for isolation, a kind of ultranationalism about Israel. I'm reminded, I made some notes to myself while I was watching the film, and there's a point in, I think, the second scene where Michael says, it's complicated, essentially, about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and his sister Holly says, if I didn't know him better, I think he was an anti-Semite. There's already this kind of conflation, or this connection drawn between Holocaust and Israel, even sort of before the conversation we're having about Jewish identity. The fact that that's already taken for granted in this conversation says a lot about how Israel and Holocaust have all been wrapped up in creating Jewish identity. So I do think he was really right at one point. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, at least in my experience going forward, but maybe that's for a later question. So I'll maybe leave my answer there.
Thank you both. I had a follow-up question, which I think you already have kind of spoken about, which is that if you don't feel that there is a kind of undue emphasis on the Holocaust in this generation's education and identity, the generation that's coming up, what might it be? And one of the things that I've heard you talk about is a new kind of focus on Israel, which has become a valence issue in the Jewish community in lots of different ways. So I'm gonna leave that piece hanging just for a minute and ask our panelists one more question. And thanks to everybody that's putting their questions in the Q&A. And I wanna make sure that we get to those. So feel free to keep on putting them in there, and feel free to put questions in there that are directed at particular cast members as well, because we wanna bring them into this conversation, or Robert, the director, as well. So my last question, although I'll have more if there's time, is about the question, something that Stephen Levenson said in 2000, or recently, when he was talking about the play that was written in 2011, and he reflected that much of what he wrote about and reflected on in the play, and that Michael says in the play, he feels differently about today. And I would say it's probably an understatement to say that, I'm going to refer to the characters by their character names, that lose children in the play. So Michael, Holly, and Abby each have a complicated and very different relationship and connection to Judaism. And while we do hear a lot about how Michael is struggling with the direction in which he sees Judaism and the Jewish community moving, he's upset about the persistence of religious traditionalism. At some point, he says something to the effect of that Judaism is regressing back to the Dark Ages with all of the religious traditionalism. And then he says, at another point, we learned the wrong lessons from the Holocaust. We learned that the world will always hate Jews, instead of what we should have actually learned, that nationalism is a sickness and it is lethal. And I think, as Robert gestured, some of his statements, which were written, almost 10 years ago by the playwright, may feel even more resonant today. So I'm wondering if Rabbi Coburn or Rabbi Bressler, as Jewish communal leaders, and you can feel free to get as personal about this as you like, if you've ever had Michael moments, I will call them, ones in which you feel that the Jewish community or Jewish leaders are taking Judaism in a direction that you find particularly problematic, that we are taking things from the past and using them in the wrong way and pushing Judaism in a direction that's not healthy or doesn't serve the Jewish community well. And I'm wondering if you have had any of those moments in your rabbinate, and how they relate to some of the themes that you saw in the play, between Michael and his siblings struggling about what to do with parts of the Jewish past and where to go with them.
I think you get to go first this time.
Yes, great.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think watching this play in the context of January 6th was really, really interesting. I tried to look closely at Michael's monologue, and I think on the one hand, he's, like I said, I think he's wrong now a little bit, that the Holocaust is now the center of Jewish life in any synagogue in America. I think part of the reason for that is my generation has come of age now. In a lot of ways, we're in the synagogues of America now. So I'm 36, and actually in sort of a funny connection, I was actually in Israel myself on a high school tour. I was on the Alexander Most High School in Israel program in fall of 2000, when the second Intifada started, just like Abby in the play. And so I kind of identify with her perspective a little bit. And I think in a lot of ways I contain both Michael and Sharon, in that I'm both vividly aware that it can happen again, especially after growing up somewhat unaware of anti-Semitism around. It's clear to me that what led to the Nazis' rise can happen again in the United States. I mean, that's one of my big takeaways from January 6th. And at the same time, it's already happened again, right? The world won't magically fix itself unless we fix it. And many of us are very disillusioned with Israel and the promise that it once held. So in terms of have I had Michael moments? Yes. And I think I've also had Sharon moments. It's Michael's monologue is callous because it's the victims of the Holocaust and the survivors didn't choose for that to be their identity. I think being angry about the way Holocaust and Israel became such pillars of Jewish identity is a bit misplaced. No one chose that. That's something that happened to the Jewish people. So I can't be that angry about it. And his insistence that we forget the Holocaust, and he says himself that's not actually really what he meant. He means he wants us to remember differently. But as Rabbi Coburn said, that's not what Jews do. Zachor, remembering, is one of our core values. I think Joey at the end, the character Joey, really gets it when he says, the way people live after they die is if we remember them. That's core to Judaism. But in terms of what lessons we should be drawing from the Holocaust, I actually was having this sort of unpacking this with my wife, and she said something really interesting that, like, in a lot of ways, the lessons that I think we need to learn are not the lessons so much of 1944, but the lessons of like 1933. That what's really important is not dwelling on concentration camps and the raw trauma of that experience, but learning from what led there, the years that led up to that, the human behavior that enabled the Nazis' rise to power and that enabled Hitler to leverage existing anti-Jewish tropes to scapegoat them for social and economic ills in Germany and consolidate his authoritarian rule. January 6th is like such a perfect case study of that. So I had that Michael moment. I feel like I had it a couple of months ago in that way. And that ties in, I think, to a question that was posed and that was sent ahead of time about survivors and what they have to teach us still. I think there's no substitute for hearing survivor stories, but in some ways their lesson is not necessarily the one we need so much right now. Many of them were through, they were young during Hitler's rise to power and not able to really understand what was going on. And as crucial as it is to hear their stories of persistence and survival, I'm not sure what we really need is an understanding of the stakes so much as understanding of how to be on guard and how to watch for the signs so that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you. A lot to think about, and feel free to ask any follow-up questions in the Q&A. And Rabbi Coburn, do you want to?
Yeah, let me just clarify something. So I can take this in different directions. The idea is like, has there been a time when we felt that Judaism was going in the wrong direction, right? It could be a different topic than what Michael was feeling, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I don't want to repeat, like Rabbi Bressler just answered that great, and I'm going to give a go in a different direction. So I was actually on a summit, like on a Zoom today. The Rabbinical Assembly, part of the conservative movement's body of rabbis, are meeting virtually this week. And we had a meeting with Priya Parker. And, she is an expert on gathering and community. And so I wrote down something she shared, which is this: rituals are both inherited and invented. And the most powerful rituals are the ones created for the need in front of you. So what struck me about that is that, like, we think about rituals such as like Kaddish, right? Which was created 2,000 years ago and still like relevant today because it fills this need right in front of us. And then we look at other rituals that we've created this year during COVID, right? Like whoever in a zillion years thought that I would be like leading a live stream service. A year ago, literally a year ago, people came to me and they're like, Rabbi, we think we should be live streaming our services. And I was like, here are all the zillion reasons why I don't want to live stream Shabbat services. And now I'm live streaming Shabbat services every week, right? Because it's like responding to the times and the needs in front of us. And what we're doing with that service looks different than what we did when we were in person. And it looks different than what it will look like when we're in person, because it's just a different reality. So the times that I have felt frustrated with Judaism is when Judaism, even as somebody who believes in a Jewish legal system, when that legal system has not moved to respond to the realities of the time. And the biggest example I can give when I had sort of my own personal Michael moment was when I was applying to rabbinical school. And I really felt like called to like live within a halachic system that was evolving and changing, and also really rooted in memory and in the past. And I mean the past as a with deep reverence, but responding, using the rabbinic voices to respond to today's crises. And you know, I was applying to rabbinical school, and the conservative movement wasn't accepting gays and lesbians to rabbinical school. And I had this choice, like I applied to RRC, to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and I was accepted, and I deferred for 2 years. In fact, I applied when I was in Israel. Also, I was in Israel 98 to 2000, studying in Jerusalem, applied and deferred, and spent 2000 to 2002 working for Hillel, trying to figure out what I was gonna do, because I felt like, how can I go to a rabbinical school that wouldn't accept me if I was a lesbian? Yet here I am, like a straight woman, and I can just go to a conservative rabbinical school, but that was the best fit for me. And what I ended up deciding was opposite of Michael, was like, you know what, get in there and fight. Like decide that you're a part of the conservative movement and your voice matters within the conservative movement, and go to a conservative rabbinical school and start a group, be an active voice, start petitioning, start working with the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards to enable Judaism to shift, to respond to the times. And, you know, it took a while. I entered rabbinical school in 2002. And while I was a part of an activist group, I can't take any credit for the reality of the tshuva that, you know, a number of rabbis, including Rabbi Eli Dorf, who was honored today by the conservative movement, wrote and was passed. But you know, the rabbis on the floor, you know, that were sort of leaders at that time were really the ones doing the active work. But look, I started in 2002 and it took till 2007. And it's a handful of years in the scope of Jewish history. It's like a minor time. For those people who are closeted in rabbinical school, it was a major amount of time. But you know, it's a totally different topic, but for me, that was like a Michael moment, because it's like, what are you going to do about it, right? Are you going to, if you feel that Judaism, that there's something that bothers you so much, are you going to decide to like, just sort of like throw up your hands and write a book? Or are you going to sort of get dirty and love it and do it from a place of love and passion and enable shifts to happen through that?
Can I respond to that, Julie?
Yeah, take 2 minutes, because I want to make sure we get to the cast too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's really a crucial point, that what's different now in Jewish communities from what Michael represents, both, you know, what his character represents, which I think is an earlier generation of Jews who wanted to bring Judaism forward, but sought to do it essentially by cutting ties with the past, right? Dismissing the Talmud and the rabbis and trying to bring it forward into modernity, which is why he gets so angry about Hebrew and, you know, and prayer and things like that. I think the impulse now is still to create the Jewish future, but not through cutting off the roots, but through re-engagement with Talmud and halakha, and also and ritual and spiritual life and all these kind of things. Which you see sort of embodied in the Sharon character too. Like I think today's Judaism is a confluence of these in a lot of ways.
Thank you both so much. I want to, I don't know what everybody that's here can see, but we have the privilege of having the cast here as well. And I want to give them an opportunity to speak about their experience doing a play in this format. So we're going to move from really intense and heavy to just a little bit of a lighter question that I think many of us were curious about, because I imagine that certainly for me, this was the first time that I watched live theater on Zoom. And it was a really thought-provoking experiment for me as a viewer. I watched it differently, and I'm sure everybody had different experiences, and feel free to share those in the Q&A or the chat as well. So I want to ask the cast, for those of you, and you could just unmute yourselves and talk or raise your hands or however you want to do this, to just speak for a minute about what it is like to do live theater in this format. Anything in particular that you found to be more compelling, or any, and I don't know whether this was the first version of a Zoom theater experience that you had. So I'll just open it up to the cast. If anybody wants to jump in, maybe we'll try to get a few minutes from each of you. It's always fun to hear actors be themselves and pull back the curtain. So go ahead. And I think there's a request to be able to see the cast in gallery view. We have tech support here. This is beyond my pay grade. So if the tech support knows how to do that, I know everybody would enjoy seeing their faces. So does anybody want to jump in first and speak to that? Go ahead, Michael. And well, not to confuse people, Michael Liu. So yes. Not the character Michael. Go ahead.
It's a very complete different way of acting, and the fact that we had such a strong cast made it a very wonderful thing to do. If you had weak people around you, it really wouldn't have come off, and it felt, you could feel the connection in this family. You understood. Watching it, when we're doing it, we don't really get to feel how it's going to come out. And watching the final product was really, it was fun to watch, and it was great to see all the people and the connections.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody else want to jump in? And then maybe at the end, Robert, if you want to talk for a minute about directing a Zoom production, which I imagine is also an interesting piece. So anybody else from the cast want to jump in and share your thoughts about being in a Zoom production?
Yeah, I can. One of the things that's completely different is it is reader's theater still. So we are reading, but the script is on the screen. And so it doesn't look like we're reading unless we're doing it badly. But we can't necessarily see each other. You can, if you work your way around right, but it's harder to form the relationships. And Michael is right that this worked because everybody was working so hard at it, and it was just, it was fun.
It is very much Arlie nails it, and we talked about this in rehearsal a lot too, how it is no replacement. It's what we have now. It's, those of us creatives that are trying to, feed that need and share these amazing stories that are out there with a different audience. It's one of the biggest things an actor does is play off of somebody in person. There's a lot of moments, and we're all just dying for this. We all wish we had it, because working like Michael said, with such an amazing cast, and we were all very strong and very dedicated to this script, to be able to be in a room with somebody, and it's not the lines a lot of time, it's what happens between the lines, and it's the reactions, and it's the emotions and the connections that we have, where a look can speak volumes. And that's what we were missing. Michael said, that we got to see the final product. I was saying to somebody earlier today or yesterday that seeing the show was the first time I got to see what Michael was doing in his monologue at the end of Act 1, and what all of Arlie's wonderful reactions to her husband, and I'm like, I finally get to see those things. This is great, So it was a brand new show for me as well, just to watch our performance.
I'm just reading in the chat, people really want it to be in gallery. So since it's a webinar, in order for us to switch it to gallery for the people who are watching, who's in charge of the Zoom? Because if you switch it in your corner to gallery, it should.
I think
switch.
it's been fixed. I think
Oh, okay.
it sounds like it's in gallery now. Yeah,
Okay, great.
great. Thanks. Perfect. Anyone else want to jump in?
I will. So this was kind of brought to my attention by a colleague of Sharon, a friend of Sharon, and I was just like, okay, yeah, I'll do this, and sent in my like audition, I guess, through video, which is weird because I'm usually used to going in and being in a room with someone and auditioning in front of people. And so I got to do as many takes as I wanted to feel like, oh, okay, this one's right. And then I sent that one in. And, 3 hours later, I get a response and I'm like, yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. You're Joey. And I'm like, cool. And, it was like Michael was saying that it's weird because when you're on like a computer and building relationships through a computer, and you've never met these people in real life, and you've never really talked to the director in real life, and it's weird, but somehow, with the strong cast and the relationships we built through this, I felt like we nailed it pretty hard, and it's been a great experience.
Thanks, John. Go ahead.
Can I add one thing, Julie? Oh, sorry, Nick. Part of what was really fun for me was the sourcing of props. Because if you're doing a stage production, you usually have wonderful people that are helping you do that. But in this case, some of us live in different cities, and I happen to live in a different state from everyone else. And so for Nick and myself, he was handing me a glass of water at one point, or like my son Joey, I needed to take his Arizona iced tea away from him. And it was so funny for us. We were, like taking pictures of what glasses in our houses looked like to see if we had one that would work for the other person that was handing it to us. And I haven't actually gone to a grocery store in months. And I went to 3 different stores to try and get the same can style of the Arizona iced tea that Joey was able to easily pick up. And they don't make that one in Colorado. And so, those were just sort of funny moments that happened that you wouldn't normally experience in a Zoom play. And, we were trying so hard to make it seem like we were in the same space. And those were some of those moments where it really was kind of funny. And also, I think, as actors, we had to source our own costumes, our own props, our own hair, our own makeup, all those things. And so, we had a day, I think the day before we started shooting, where people just kind of held up clothes, like, what do you think about this for Holly? And like a sweater that I thought was awesome. I was always too matronly. And I was like, really? That's like the nicest sweater I have. And I'm playing a woman whose financial resources far exceed my own. So like trying to get to that place was really funny. And Nick was like texting me from Goodwill, looking at pictures of different classes, and I was trying to suggest to him what I thought his outfit should look like as my husband. And it was really fun to be able to have your hand in those types of pieces where you normally wouldn't as an actor.
I see someone is asking about, can we hear each other? And yeah, the process, the filming process and the rehearsal process was just like this Zoom meeting. We were just interacting as, on Zoom, but we didn't see each other because the script was literally in front of our faces as we were reading instead of the pictures.
Thanks. Nick, do you want to jump in?
So yeah, one of the things you were talking about is that, interaction with each other here, but also with the audience. I mean, filming is a totally different experience than doing a live production. We feed off y'all. We're in there, just as much as each other. And so trying to have that element, because you're in your box, you've been doing this, we've been doing this for a couple of weeks, every night. We are working with each other. We've got a great cast, there's lots of rapport, but then you get to tech week and you're there, okay, and now we're adding in sound and this and that, and then filming night, and it's still you in your little box, and there's no audience, and there's no different location. I mean, it's an entire different animal, you know. I mean, and so it was lovely to have such a connected cast, director, team in general, to be able to surmount that element too, because it's really easy to make everything just seem, it's rote, it's boring, it's no longer a living, breathing thing. But we had a family in all of its messy wonderfulness, and for the film production, you know, it comes through. You know, and I've been in a few of these, and luckily had good groups where you get past that part. But it would be very easy to see a show fall on its face, you know, because there's that live element that we are used to as live theater performers, you know. And so thank you all for watching at home, and this talk back is another wonderful element, you know. It feeds us as performers to be able to be interacting with the audience, you know, because it's something that we don't get to do at all now.
Thank you so much. Robert, do you want to share a little bit about what it was like to direct this type of experience?
Sure. This is the second play that I've directed via Zoom, although the other one, we were still allowed to film in the theater. But one of the things many times during rehearsal, I would say, oh, if we were only in 2 dimensions, you know, if we were in person, this could happen, that could happen, just the looks and things. In fact, every once in a while, I'd have to create something, some business to give the feeling of, you know, that there really was interaction between the people. But other than that, you know, the cast, all the actors said what I was going to say, and I will publicly say this for all the people listening, is as a director, I told the cast this in an email last night, I never know who's going to come in to audition for a show, and you hope you get the right people. And with this production, I hit the jackpot. And this is a production that I will not forget.
Well, we should just end it there, but I don't want to lose our last 8 minutes, but that's beautiful. If we were all in the theater, you'd hear us all saying, "Aw." That's it's beautiful to hear. You know, it's even interesting for those of us that only see you all as characters to have this opportunity to hear from you as people and characters. So I wanna lift up a question that Rabbi Mark Soloway asked. And this is a question for Lance in the play Michael, where he says, I'm curious if there's time to hear about what Michael was experiencing during his father's story of the liberation of Dachau. That was powerful. So, yeah.
Well, I'll start by giving a big old shout out to Michael for his delivery of that. And I mean, there were so many times when we were talking about not being in person, not being able to get that physical or personal interaction, being present. In a way, Zoom made listening, I don't want to say more important, because as an actor, listening is insanely important, but it was a different process for me. I got to, you know, we kind of answered this question of, we have the Zoom on the screen, and we've got like our script on the same screen over here, so it looks like we're reading, or not reading, we're interacting. I got to listen. He's got a 2.5 or 2-page monologue. I'm just like, all right, I'm done. I don't have any lines. I get to listen to this man deliver this insanely powerful monologue. So for Michael, being so educated, being so cerebral and book smart, not world smart maybe, but book smart. There was a lot going on there. A lot of the things we had discussed, Robert talked about, this is the first time that Dad has told this story. You know, people, especially of that generation in that war, do not talk about these things, you know. So I got to listen to it every night with new ears. Being an educated guy, Michael probably knew a lot of these things. You know, he had studied, he had researched, he had probably listened to survivors, but to hear it come from his father is a much different telling. So I was able to kind of take that journey, and there were ebbs and flows where I hope I was able to convey things like, yes, I know, I've heard this. Yes, I know about the bodies. Yes, okay, I've heard that story. But to come from his father in such a personal way, there are moments of shame that I felt in, you know, while listening to him, moments of, you know, well, shame, honestly, like, oh, now I finally hear it. Now I finally, I hear what you're saying, you know? So, I mean, too long didn't read version, a lot of different emotions. It was a wonderful journey every night hearing that monologue, and discovering something new every single time. And if I heard it again right now, I'd probably discover more things.
Thank you. A question that came in for Michael Liu, and I think this is a question for any of you that had to kind of figure out how to convey some, like a real experience when you just have a box. This one is about what was it like to kind of act as if you've had a stroke, and how did you figure that out? I know there was another scene where you're sleeping. So those were all just really creative ways of using a box to convey that something about the character has changed. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, or Robert or anybody else from the cast that had to kind of embody what would normally be a full body acting experience while you're sitting and in one little cube here.
Well, you you figure out, first of all, how would you, if you were that person, how would you be reacting physically, emotionally, and so after you figure it out, then you go with that and try to embody it as best you can.
Anyone else have one of those sorts of experiences? Or yeah, go ahead, John.
So, well, I was just going to say that everything in theater is very exaggerated, and it's to show your emotions during like what the character is feeling. And especially on Zoom, like you can't really like make out like everything that person's doing because it's not like a blown up image, it's in person. But when like you're on Zoom, like Lou sleeping or someone taking a glass from someone, it just has to be like more exaggerated than you would do on a stage. It would be like, you know, like that, like, and me when I blew out the candles at the end of the first act, I had to really exaggerate that to like let the audience know that, yeah, this is what I'm doing. I'm blowing out the candle.
Go ahead, Robert. Oh, I think you're muted.
One of the things, I saw a question about the end of the play, the final scene of the play. And for a long time, that really bothered me. What is this? And I think Lance one night said, why is Joey in the play? Or maybe someone else did. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out why he was in the play and what this last scene was. And then it hit me. Of all the characters in the play and characters we talk about, Joey is the one character who has no baggage. And what the scene becomes is Michael passing down family history. We see this when they're celebrating Lou's birthday, and we see it again at the end. The other reason that Joey's in the play is because when he talks about sitting with grandma as she's dying and getting smaller and smaller in the bed, Joey is giving Michael permission to finally mourn his mother's death. And then the very end, where they're reciting what they see or what Abby saw, is, again, it's passing down the history of Jerusalem. And Joey says nothing in that. He has no lines in that recitation at the end. And so it's a passing down. And as I said in one of the promotions for the show, is this play operates on 3 levels. The personal, and what drives the play is not Jewish identity, but what are we going to do about Dad? The historical, which does bring in Jewish identity and the history of Israel and Jews in the United States. And then at the very end of the play, with his reciting of what Abby saw, he lifts it up. The play becomes spiritual. And some critics say that for them, it doesn't work. It was unearned. And and I happen to disagree. The music that played underneath, if you heard it, is a piece called Jerusalem of Gold. That is not in the script. I added that. I wanted some music underneath. There's no other music in the show. There's no pre-show music. What we hear at the beginning of each act are sounds of the street. And that was all planned by me, with the good help of Amanda.
Can I add just a thought?
Yes.
So something that struck me when I watched this show was, and I mentioned this to Wendy earlier, that these the characters were not tremendously likable, and that but yet I still felt compassion for each of them, even in their not particularly likable, but I felt a deep compassion for them. And I think that was because they were all so nuanced and struggling to be seen and to be heard and to be loved. And it's none of these characters, there were these siblings who could not see and value one another, right? They all did different things and had different ways of walking in the world. And because of that, they had an inability to just look at one another and say I acknowledge you for the gifts that you bring to this world and for who you are. And even if we think differently, to be able to debate without just attacking. And this just this deep desire to be loved, which I think is the reality. We all have a deep desire to be loved and to be seen. And I just think that was one of the things I held so deeply after watching it.
One of the things that we haven't talked about, and there's not going to be time, is the mother, who had a great deal to do to shape her children. And I'm not going to get into the old Jewish, the stereotype of the Jewish mother, but that plays a great deal in how these people turn out. And that is equally as important. The other thing that, listening to this is the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. And that comes out with Ellen, where I think it's Sharon, maybe it's both Sharon and Holly, allude, well, you're not Jewish, you don't have to worry, you're not going to be taken off to a concentration camp. You're Swedish, and to which Ellen's wonderful reply is Norwegian, actually. So there's so much in this play that we could be here for 4 hours.
we could, and I would love to stay on, and I'm sure so many of the people that are here would love to stay on. I know that I have to hold the hard line as the moderator. I want to just echo something that I heard from all of you, which is that on the one hand, this is a play about Jewish identity, but on the other hand, this is a very universal play about how we take our past and what we do with it, how we honor those that came before us and find ways to move ahead with the new realities that we're faced. I think that wherever people might have been coming from, actors or audience members alike, I think we can all agree that the relationships that you built and showed to us as characters was palpable, even on this Zoom screen. I think that we all, as Rabbi Coburn said, whether we loved you or hated you, we felt like we were really watching family dynamics at play in such an authentic way. And it was a really powerful experience to experience theater in this way. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of those that are here and those that are not here, but that had the wonderful opportunity of watching this beautiful production in this new format. Thank you for opening our eyes to new ways of experiencing theater and new ways of grappling with universal and particular questions. And we hope that we see more of all of you and this theater in the future. So thank you so much to everybody that's been here. Thank you to the cast, to the director, to the behind the scenes people that put this on. We're so grateful to have had this opportunity to start to unpack what was such a rich production. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Julie. That was amazing. Thank you, Rabbi Coburn. Thank you, Rabbi Bressler. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Cass. This was delightful. Thanks.
There's also some like interesting notes in the.
Yes, we didn't get to everything, but you really spurred so much thought in all of us. So thank you.
Welcome. Thank you to our guest panelists. Thank you for agreeing to take part.